Life science, this lesson is the cell in its environment. You're in your bedroom studying, and you smell something good. Someone is cooking dinner. How did the smell travel from the kitchen to your nose? During cooking, molecules from soup and many other foods diffuse, or spread farther and farther apart. The molecules are also carried by air currents. Your nose sniffs in the molecules and sends a message to your brain. Even if only one molecule in 10 million carries the odor, your nose will send a smell message. Amazingly, your brain can identify about 10,000 different smells. Remember, however, this does also work for things that don't smell so good. So if you're the smelly kid in class, you may end up with this situation. So how do materials move into and out of cells? Cells have structures that protect their contents from the world outside of it. To live and function, however, cells must let certain materials enter and leave. Oxygen and water and particles of food must be able to move into a cell, while carbon dioxide and other waste materials must move out. Much as a gatekeeper controls the flow of traffic into and out of a parking lot, the cell membrane controls how materials move into and out of a cell. Every cell is surrounded by a cell membrane. The cell membrane consists of a double layer of lipid molecules lined up side by side. Remember that lipids are a group of organic compounds found in living things. Here and there in the double lipid layer, you can see proteins, some with chains of carbohydrates attached. Other carbohydrate chains sit on the surface of the membrane. All these molecules play important roles in helping materials move through the cell membrane. Some materials move freely across the cell membrane. Others move less freely or not at all. The cell membrane is selectively permeable, which means that some substances can cross the membrane while others cannot. Substances that can move into and out of a cell do so by means of one of two processes: passive transport or active transport. Diffusion and osmosis, both are forms of passive transport. If you've ever ridden a bicycle down a hill, you know that it takes hardly any of your own energy to go fast. But you do have to use your energy in order to get back up the hill. Moving materials across a cell membrane sometimes requires the cell to use its own energy. At other times, the cell uses no energy. The movement of dissolved materials across the membrane without using the cell's energy is called passive transport. Molecules are moving away from one another all the time. As they move, they bump into one another. The more molecules there are in a space, the more they are said to be concentrated in that space. So they collide more often. Collisions cause molecules to push away from one another. Over time, as molecules continue colliding and moving apart, they can become less concentrated. Eventually, they spread evenly throughout the space. Diffusion is the process by which molecules move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. Consider a unicellular organism that lives in a pond. It gets oxygen from the water. Many more molecules of oxygen are dissolved in the water outside the cell than inside the cell. In other words, the concentration of oxygen is higher outside the cell. So what happens? Oxygen moves easily into the cell. the diffusion of oxygen into the cell does not require the cell to use any of its own energy. Diffusion is one form of passive transport. Like oxygen, water passes easily into and out of a cell across the cell membrane. Osmosis is the diffusion of water molecules across a selectively permeable membrane. Because cells cannot function properly without adequate water, many cellular processes depend on osmosis. Osmosis is a form of passive transport. In this picture, we can see what happens to the cells of plants when we change the concentrations of salts within the water. If we make a hypotonic solution, one with very little salt or dissolved material in it, much of the water rushes into the cell. This is called turgid. If we make a solution of water with a large amounts of salts and other dissolved materials, we create a hypertonic solution, and water rushes out of the cell. Osmosis can have important effects on cells and entire organisms. The plant cells that we see here have a healthy flow of water both into and out of each cell in the isotonic and hypotonic pictures. Under certain conditions, osmosis can cause water to move out of the cells more quickly than it moves in. When this happens, the cytoplasm shrinks and the cell's membrane pulls away from the cell wall. If we end up with a solution that is extremely hypotonic, we can actually have the cell walls rupture, which would kill the cells as well. So here's a picture of a turgid cell where a lot of the water has rushed out, causing the membrane to shrink in towards the center. And here's another picture of a cell inside of a hypotonic solution. Oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse freely across the cell membrane. Other molecules, such as sugar, do not. Sugars cannot cross easily through the membrane's lipid molecules. In a process called facilitated diffusion, proteins in the cell membrane form channels through which the sugars can pass. The word facilitated means to make easier. As we see in the picture, the proteins provide a pathway for the sugars to diffuse. The proteins function much in the way downspouts guide water that flows from the roof of a house onto the ground. Facilitated diffusion uses no cell energy and is another form of passive transport. Molecules in cells must often move in the opposite direction from the way they would naturally move due to diffusion. That is, the molecules move from a place of lower concentration to a place of higher concentration. Cells have to supply the energy to do this work. Just as you would supply the energy to pedal a bike uphill. Active transport is the movement of materials across the cell membrane using cellular energy. As in facilitated diffusion, proteins within the cell membrane play a key role in active transport. Using the cell's energy, transport proteins pick up specific molecules and carry them across the membrane. Substances that are carried into and out of cells by this process include calcium, potassium, and sodium. Notice in this picture we're talking about hydrogen ions that are inside of the cell. There's a lower concentration, therefore This hydrogen ion does not want to move out of that protein. Energy is supplied, allowing that hydrogen ion to be passed outward. Some materials, such as food particles, are too large to cross the cell membrane. In a process called endocytosis, the cell membrane changes shape and engulfs the particle. You can see this process happening here. Once the food particle is engulfed, the cell membrane fuses, pinches off a vacuole within the cell, and slowly dissolves the food particle. The reverse process, called exocytosis, allows large particles to leave a cell. During exocytosis, a vacuole first fuses with the cell membrane, then the cell membrane forms an opening to the outside and spills out the contents of the vacuole. Both endocytosis and exocytosis require energy from the cell. We can see in this picture where the amoeba engulfs that large particle of food. The membrane fuses together, and eventually the amoeba completely engulfs the food vacuole. Inside of your notes, you see a picture that looks like this. It shows a drop of food coloring placed on a plate of gelatin, and it slowly spreads out due to diffusion. Draw a picture of how you think the plate would look if diffusion continues. So thinking about diffusion and thinking about materials moving into and out of cells, what do you suppose the difference would be in size based on these two cells? And how would that size affect the process of passing nutrients and also waste into and out of the cell? And then finally, using this picture inside of your notes, label both the passive and active transport systems, and then also identify what type of passive or active transport it is. And finally, looking at this picture, imagine that the yellow line represents a cell membrane. What is the overall direction in which water will travel as a result of osmosis? You can simply put an arrow on here indicating what direction it would travel.